An unexpected revelation. Nobody wanted to hear the truth. Moreover, the world of Street Outlaws splits apart the instant Daddy Dave says it out loud. Methods that might never be fixed. The night was broken by the call. When Chief's phone started ringing at 2:41 in the morning, the digital clock on his nightstand pulled him in from the brink of slumber. Hours spent working beneath the hood of a defiant Chevrolet that wouldn't collaborate, and his thoughts remained somewhat entangled in fantasies of thundering motors and quarter-meal strips. For a while, head hot about letting it go to voicemail, thinking it was a tow truck or another racer with bail money issues, a circumstance that might hold off until dawn. But then he noticed the glowing name. His screen in the shadows, and a chill took hold of his chest. Unless something had gone horribly wrong, Daddy Dave never called at this hour. The hand of the chief acted instinctively, swiping to respond before his conscious mind had had a chance to completely integrate his instincts. He applied pressure to the phone to his ear and waited, his heart rate already rising to a level that seemed risky for a man who'd been jogging for the greater part of a week on coffee and adrenaline. "Chief." Davis, the voice that came through the line, was incorrect in ways that Chief was unable to explain right away. There was a hollowness about it, a tremor that was hidden beneath coerced control and described a man teetering on the brink of something he couldn't return on foot. "I want you to pay attention to what I have to say, and need you to wait until I'm done to interrupt me. Could you help me with that?" The chief, every nerve in his body went into alert mode as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet striking the chilly floor. He had known Dave for over 20 years, had seen him emerge from damaged race vehicles that appeared to Coke cans that were crumpled, had supported him during bankruptcies and divorces and losses like these shatter weaker men. However, he had never heard this specific Dave's vocal tone, this blend of surrender and barely restrained rage that said everything they believed to be true about their world will be altered by whatever was about to happen. "I discovered something," Dave went on before Chief could think of a reply. "I discovered something I can't avoid knowing. Additionally, when I tell you about it, and this information exits the four walls where I can't put it back in the box, I'm standing here. The crew, the streets, the show, and the brotherhood we've formed are all about to be put to the test in ways we've never encountered, and I don't think we'll make it through what happens next." The chief's lips became parched. His thoughts raced through potential outcomes, each one worse than the last. Undercover operations, federal investigations, informants, non-accidental deaths. His hand clenched around them till his knuckles hurt. Furthermore, his voice sounded harder than he had intended when he eventually spoke. "Where are you, presently?" "The farm," Dave replied. "I need you here in an hour. Bring Monza and Sean. No one else. Not until we determine the extent of this and what we're dealing with. If the incorrect before we determine what to do with this proof, someone discovers that I have it, putting us all in risk," the weight-bearing legend. Daddy Dave's ascent through the ranks of the underground racing culture in Oklahoma City wasn't the result of chance or circumstance. Fire was used to forge it, that constructed with 10,000 hours of work in poorly lit garages where the scent of cigarette smoke, racing fuel, and feverish ambition. When he was younger, he had driven worn-out cars with more heart than judgment, faced seasoned veterans who ought to have destroyed him but managed to avoid doing so. Something in the manner in which hostile to racing that made him stand out right away. A deliberate hostility, a readiness to push machinery and himself beyond acceptable bounds, as well as an almost magical capacity to read a track in a matter of seconds prior to a light turning green. In the early 2000s, Oklahoma City's roadways were a different world, where mistakes might cost you more than just your reputation. Cash. Dave soon discovered that there was no respect in this setting. It was acquired by performing consistently, and a refusal to concede when confronted with difficulties. He constructed his first significant racing automobile with borrowed funds and repurposed components, spending a lot of time at night perfecting every detail until the machine reacted to his touch like an extension of his they vanished into morning's own nervous system. When he eventually put the vehicle on the road and began defeating other drivers in races who had been in charge of these roads for years, people started to pay attention. His collaboration with Chief became legendary. Two men whose methods of racing were complementary to one another was almost if fate had planned it. Where Chief provided meticulous accuracy in addition to his engineering genius, Dave contributed his unadulterated instincts and an almost reckless lack of fear. Collectively, they comprised the foundation of the future 405 crew, a group of racers who used a combination of skill and dominance to conquer their domain, strategy, as well as an unwavering sense of devotion that kept them united throughout triumphs and heartbreaking defeats. However, the path to become a legend was filled with moments that almost brought everything to an end. Dave's 2015 collision ought to have a cow call him. The kind of catastrophic impact that defies physics and transforms race automobiles into unidentifiable metal tangles and directs drivers to emergency rooms under circumstances when physicians use terms like critical and uncertain. He had left that behind. Disaster in the end, but not before suffering scars that went beyond the obvious. The recuperation process was harsh. Months of physical treatment and mental struggles to overcome anxieties that surfaced in calm times when he had too much time to contemplate death and the thin lines separating life and death at 200 miles per hour. Dave consistently presented himself as the unwavering fighter, the driver who could overcome any obstacle and come out on the other side stronger. He was the source of stability and inspirational leadership for the crew. Confidence in the face of seemingly dismal circumstances. However, there was a price for that appearance that few outside of his inner circle comprehended. Every moment in front of the camera, every race, every public appearance needed him to project power despite the fact that his body ached from past wounds that had never completely healed and his mind struggled with uncertainties he couldn't afford to express out loud. Slowly, the strain of bearing that weight built up, that like a container of water being filled one drop at a time until it was about to overflow. Dave has always been the one to whom others confided, the constant presence that could take in their disappointments and anxieties without passing judgment. However, when the strong man's own foundation begins to crumble, who does he turn to? Who bears the burden when the person on whom everyone is dependent is unable to do it alone? These were unsettling questions. Dave had been vulnerable for months prior to the revelation, concealing it behind his characteristic stoicism, manner, and a sardonic sense of humor. The lengthening shadows. Monza was the first to observe Daddy Dave's alteration, and it occurred during what ought to have been a routine late December 2024 discussion on carburetor tweaks. They had been standing in Monza's garage, half-assembled and surrounded by the cozy mess of racing geared engines, discussing the kinds of technical specifics that typically generated lively arguments and friendly disputes. However, Dave's answers that day were hurried and rambling. When Monza Dave didn't even smile when he joked about a mutual friend's dubious life decisions. He simply gazed at his jaw, as if he were chewing on things he couldn't bring himself to say. On the workbench before him, Monza had made an effort to softly inquire as to whether everything was all right at home, if residual consequences of previous injuries were resurfacing, and if he had anything he wanted to discuss over a beer, away from the stress and cacophony of the racing scene. Dave had sidestepped with practiced ease, forcing a smile that stopped short of his eyes and shifting the topic so deftly that Monza nearly persuaded himself that the entire conversation had been a dream. Nearly. However, the discomfort persisted, like a splinter embedded in the surface that Monza was unable to fully remove. Nova discovered murder.it later during an early January crew meeting where they were organizing the racing schedule for the season and talking about possible opponents from different cities. Dave sat in the strangely silent nook that he appeared to be concentrating on his phone, but his eyes weren't really following the screen. Chief inquired Dave's response to their request for his opinion on whether they need to accept a challenge from a Texas team came many seconds too late, as though he had been dragged back from a great distance. The response itself was legitimate from a strategic, tactical, and acceptable standpoint. However, anybody who was paying attention would have been alarmed by the delivery's irregularities. Around the same time, the late-night disappearances began. Dave's hours had always been erratic. Street racers seldom followed regular timetables, but this was an exception. He would arrive at the garage early that morning, reeking of fatigue and road dust, and providing evasive justifications for checking on any racing locations or meetings with suppliers of parts that, when given too much attention, didn't quite add together. His phone became a constant in his hand, and when it buzzed, he would quickly leave a conversation. The calls were anything from casual, as he moved to corners where he could talk in hushed tones. Chief observed everything, documenting every odd incident and unusual conduct with the same level of care used to identify engine issues. He had known Dave long enough to know when his friend was having problems from within, and this seemed more significant than money worries or personal issues. This seemed to be the type offload that changes a man, changing his facial features and casting shadows that had not previously existed in his eyes. Chief made several attempts to give Dave a chance to converse by arranging late-night drives where they can do so without the team around, offering to assist with whatever issue was obviously bothering him and emphasizing that there would be no condemnation whatever confession is required. However, Dave was still imprisoned behind walls he had purposefully built that care, sidestepping every attempt at deep dialogue with the dexterity of someone who had mastered the art of avoidance until it was instinctive. The team became increasingly irritated as the days became weeks, and Dave's odd conduct persisted inexplicably. Without any information, speculation was on the rampage. Some speculated that he might be coping with health problems that he didn't want to make public. Others questioned whether he was attempting to hide issues from the cameras because they were in his personal life, and the public attention that comes with appearing on a show that millions of people watched. As it happened, the truth was even worse than they had anticipated. Dave wasn't withdrawing due to private issues or personal demons. Challenges. He had stumbled onto something that threatened to rip the cloth itself apart. Therefore, he was pulling away out of the family they had created together. He was making a valiant effort to determine how to deal with it without ruining everyone. In the process, he showed concern. He was gradually being crushed by the weight of that knowledge, one day at a time. A moment. Additionally, the seclusion necessary to maintain such a terrible secret was devouring him from the inside out. The proof that made all the difference. Daddy Dave decided to share his discovery in a garage on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. This before being turned into a storage facility. The unremarkable metal building had been home to a modest manufacturing enterprise. Facilities for racing gear. Monza and Chief Shah arrived minutes apart. Another. In the pre-dawn darkness of a January morning, their cars were rolling up to the gravel lot as the temperature of their breath created visible clouds in the air as they hovered barely above freezing. They were all unaware of the precise reason. Despite the urgency with which they were being called, Dave's tone of voice had indicated that this wasn't a circumstances that might be postponed till more civilized times. Inside, Dave was waiting under the fluorescent lights overhead, creating harsh shadows on features that appeared to have aged weeks and years. The garage's interior had been emptied of its typical items, leaving a folding table in the middle of the room with four metal chairs. The table was covered with a variety of paperwork, photos, computer printouts, handwritten notes in yellow, and what looked to be financial data. Dave's unique script is angular. The overwhelming amount of evidence indicated weeks or even months of research, with many hours were spent solving a puzzle that no one else was aware existed. Chief's stomach dropped as he walked over to the table and started looking over the documents in front of him, racing data that didn't fit official documents. Telephoto lens photos depicting encounters between individuals and team members. They didn't recognize each other. Statements from banks showing oddly timed cash deposits that correspond with races in which favorite vehicles experienced mysterious mechanical breakdowns. Images of text messages that employed coded language regarding agreements, payments, and results that were predetermined prior to any engines starting up on the nights of races. This was not conjecture or suspicious conjecture. This was evidence of systematic corruption inside their own ranks that can be verified and documented. I've been focusing on this since, although his hands were shaking from sorting through the documents, Dave's voice remained steady as he said, October. It began when I discovered some anomalies in the timing data from our summertime races. First, little things, fractions off a second that, when I compared them to GPS logs and onboard camera footage, didn't quite add up. I believe that it might just have been a human error or a malfunctioning piece of equipment. However, as I dug deeper, the more patterns began to appear that were too big to be mistaken or attributed to chance. Sean grabbed one of the pictures, examining it with a look that quickly shifted between recognition and bewilderment, and ultimately concentrating on what appeared to be bodily suffering. A crew member they had raced with was depicted in the picture, someone they'd trusted with their lives for years, someone they'd invited to birthday celebrations and family picnics on perilous roadways where snap judgments could spell the difference between returning home and visiting the hospital, encountering a man who was employed by a rival racing organization. It looked as though the meeting was happening in a section of town where people went to avoid being noticed. There was a restaurant. This dates back at least 2 years, Dave went on, positioning himself at the front of the table as if he were a prosecutor presenting his case. Perhaps longer, but the furthest I can go with confidence is 2 years ago. One of our crew members has been feeding information to outside parties, disclosing specifics about our vehicles, tactics, and intentions prior to competitions. However, it is more detrimental than merely obtaining intelligence. Evidence of active sabotage has been found. Races that were held purposeful, mechanical malfunctions that were designed to occur at particular times, even situations that we believed were unintentional, but that might have been planned. Monza's face had turned white, and his voice sounded shaky as he spoke that sounded hollow. According to what you're telling us, some of the races we lost, some of the collisions that almost claimed lives, those weren't only unlucky or sincere errors. There was someone actively working against us from within our own family. Dave nodded slowly, and everyone in the room felt as though a physical weight had been placed on them. Force. I'm telling you, someone we've put our trust in, someone we've defended, someone we've regarded like family, has been swindling us out of our money. Chief was breathing more rapidly as his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The ramifications flooded his consciousness. What number of near misses could have been prevented? The number of victories been taken from them by someone who was meant to be fighting alongside them? How often did they get together after terrible race evenings, offering each other comfort and resolving to put in more effort and perform better, without realizing that the issue was a cancer that was spreading within their own organization, not their performance or preparation? Who ice it? Sean inquired. And like a guillotine blade poised to fall, the question hung in the air. Everybody present in that room understood that once the name was said, they couldn't take it back or act as though they hadn't discovered what they knew now. The disclosure would necessitate judgments and action that would drastically change the environment off-tier racing community and made damage bonds formed through decades of mutual hardship and success. Dave extracted a last piece of paper from his jacket pocket, holding it for a brief minute before putting it in knit on the table, face down. I need everyone to understand something before I turn this over. Once you're aware of what it is, we are committed to a course that will become unpleasant if this information is shared among us. Confrontations will occur. Legal issues will arise. There will be uncontrollable media interest and repercussions that will affect all crew members, both guilty and innocent. People will have to make a decision. Sides, and not everyone will choose the side we believe they ought to. When he turned the paper over, a name was visible. That was like a bodily blow to each of them. The ensuing quiet was complete, barely broken by the loud fluorescent buzz of the overhead lights and the sound of vehicles on a neighboring freeway. Since the name on that paper wasn't an outsider or a recent recruit, it was a key figure in their business, someone whose treachery felt more like the ground rupturing beneath their feet than a knife in the back. The fracture lines developed within hours when brothers turned against each other. Beyond the four people who had met in that sealed garage, word of Dave's revelation spread. By dawn, the whole team was aware something disastrous had been discovered. There were few details. Chief and Dave kept details under wraps. Control, but enough escaped to contaminate the air. Suspicions quickly spread, making lifelong pals defensive and suspicious. The initial altercation broke out in Murder Nova's store. Crew members showed up claiming to be working on automobiles, but they soon made it apparent that they were looking for answers. The defendant, the traitor, wasn't there. Their absence simply grew worse despite Dave's insistence that they be kept away until decisions were made. The rage. Charges were hurled not only at the invisible traitor, but also at Dave. "Who granted you permission to play, detective?" yelled one crewman. "You looked into the family behind our backs, collected evidence like a police officer, and then dumped this without giving them a chance to defend themselves," Chief said over the commotion. Dave had brought the proof that IT was overpowering and serious to him. This was not a suspicion or a hearsay. It was a known treachery that had cost lives, races, and money. There was no way it could be talked off. Nevertheless, the crew broke up in unexpected ways. Some supported Dave instantly, believing that his actions were required to reveal a malignancy before it had a chance to spread. Others viewed him as the violator of a sacred trust, contending that internal matters should never be resolved with paperwork that could fall into the wrong hands. Allies of the suspected traitor promoted a counterargument. Dave had been hacked by a desire for power, paranoia, or resentment. His reclusive conduct turned out to be evidence of instability. They insisted on a public dispute. Suspicions were only heightened by Dave's rejection, which he justified by claiming worries about intimidation and manipulation. Sean was caught between the two factions. He had carefully examined the evidence and was aware that it ought to be rejected, willful blindness, but he had also raced alongside the accused, whom he had trusted for years, depended on them for his survival. It seemed impossible to reconcile lived loyalty with factual evidence. Next, portions of crews in other cities were exposed by Dave's evidence. In under 48 hours, the narrative broke, rumor twisted, dashing underground through the street. Previous defeats were questioned. Events were canceled. The suspicion caused the crew's years-long reputation to crumble. Nova attempted to mediate the murder by planning gatherings aimed at re-establishing togetherness. Rather, they turned into verbal altercations. Old resentments came back and unrelated disputes were turned into weapons. The fraternity that formerly characterized them now felt as though the reality had broken an illusion. Dave suffered a terrible toll. He would anticipated opposition, but not to be shunned by those he cared about. At times, he questioned whether it would have been simpler to remain silent. If lies were a stronger foundation for peace than the truth, then ruined everything. Then he recalled the drivers who were hurt, the money that was lost, the crashes that weren't mishaps, and his determination came back. Some facts were also vital to remain hidden, regardless of the expense of revealing them. The accounting. The choice to proceed was made on a morning when the bitterly cold rain turned streets of Oklahoma City into dangerous black ice mirrors, making it impossible for anybody to the intellect would try to race. Everyone looked intent on driving too fast, though. Regardless, Dave sat by himself in his garage, containing a phone that linked him to the vehicles and tools that had characterized his adult Lafido, a lawyer who focuses on matters involving fraud and conspiracy. The discussion was clinical, detached, and concentrated on possible criminal charges and evidentiary standards and civil remedies that seemed very different from the emotional destruction that his racing family was going through. If the lawyer's voice crackled a little across the connection as he said, "You proceed forward with this formally, must realize that neither how far it spreads nor who is trapped in the blast radius can be controlled. Law enforcement will intervene. Investigations will be conducted that go beyond the person you've recognized. There will be a subpoena for financial records. Even those unrelated to the treachery could nevertheless face examination whether their names are mentioned in any part of the records. This goes far beyond settling a score inside your racing team." Dave felt the weight of that fact land on his shoulders as he closed his eyes. He would begin this inquiry with the sole goal of figuring out why something fell off, why patterns weren't aligning, why did persistent doubts keep him up at night. He had no intention of becoming a whistleblower or inciting the kind of the lawyer was describing a thorough unraveling. However, he was now at a fork in the road where both routes appeared to equally damaging, and the decision felt more like picking which version of the disaster he was prepared to endure. Handling it the old-fashioned manner was the alternative to proceeding lawfully. Internal conflict resolution, street justice, and the kind of rugged frontier ethics that the before cameras, sponsorships, and other modern conveniences, racing underground attorneys became involved. That route required facing the traitor head-on, permitting them to confront the crew they had deceived, and enforcing any penalties the community determined were suitable. It might be harsh and cruel, leaving no authoritative record to set a standard or discourage such actions in the future.